Hi, DFI podcast listeners. Welcome back. This is our second part of a deep dive modulus of subgrade reaction. I'm here with Tayler Day. Taylor's a senior engineer with UES, and he does this for a living. He looks at geotech reports. He reads your part about uh, the application of subgrade reaction. And so if you wonder who's reading it, it's this guy sitting to my left. In the first part of this series, we talked about the definition of subgrade reaction and how it is really a communication device that takes the geotechnical world, soil layering, soil compressibility, rate of loading, those kind of things, and it turns it into one value. On the flip side, you've got the structural engineer who is going from types of loading, whether it's a compressive or maybe some overturning or bending moment in the slab, getting different stresses in the soil because of that. And of course, his comes down to needing one value that defines how the soil is behaving, and that's modulus of subgrade reaction. So it's not a parameter, it's a device, and it's been historically a useful device, but I think that's been lost a little bit.
Definitely. Yeah. I think we've seen that. We're going to talk about a couple publications here, and I think just the tone of the publications is kind of describes that change in mindset, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the first one that we're going to talk a little bit about is Terzaghi's 1955 paper in geotechnique.
Yep. 30 pages.
30 pages devoted to modulus subgrade reaction. Um, and I'm light homework. We read it. Anything here strikes at you?
Yeah, I think that talking about the formulation of it and the complication of it, right? Like actually putting some numbers uh to how complicated this thing would be and why it exists, right? So when you think about our settlements, we've really reduced a lot of things on both the structural and geotech side using software. I think a lot of people now, um, you can put some really simple inputs in and get some really simple outputs, and there's a lot of math going on in behind the scenes. And so that kind of summarizes why this parameter was made anyways. And so the most interesting part about from the first section I found was that this actually came about for a very specific topic, using railroad ties on
Yeah.
ballast. And it makes sense why this would be the parameter they would choose, because railroad ties are one size. And so they're starting with, okay, well, this is known and the loading is pretty known and pretty consistent. And so we just need a way to,
And the rate of loading
and the rate of
is
loading.
big
And
for
so we
all of
need to
those.
be able to just figure out what the deflection will be or the displacement. Um, and, talking about rate of loading, deflection versus displacement kind of thing. But that part jumped out to me, that's where we started. And now we're using it for all kinds of stuff.
I, you know, Probably this paper, at least the values that are given in it are still around today. And what I find interesting about the body of the paper is that it basically says it's either sand or clay.
Yeah.
There's no layering, there's no soft clay, there's no loose sand or dense sand, or it's funny. It's just like it's you can tell immediately the way it was written is that it was a huge advancement in the numerical analysis of a device, but it really didn't try to go into what, from geotechs are like, well, if I have 6 inches of clay over sand,
Yeah.
is it now a clay or sand?
Well, we're talking to DFI members, right? Or
Yeah.
or people who at least follow DFI, and uh, we're used to dealing with things that are super deep, right? Like we're used to putting things on deep foundations or ground improvement. And you think about the range of geotech reports we've seen, 3x3 footings to, I mean, I've seen 156-foot diameter mats. Uh, and they all have recommendations for subgrade
Correct. They
modulus.
do.
And
They
so
do.
if I have every geotech knows the kind of 2B rule for the depth of stress influence.
I mean, that's exactly the point. We made that point earlier. It's like, what's the modulus of subgrade reaction for a wheel load in a warehouse?
Yeah.
It's 150 PCI.
Yeah.
What's the modulus subgrade reaction beneath a mat supporting a 15-story building?
Yeah.
150
Yeah.
PCI.
And you talk about clay or sand, if I'm going 2B on a 150-foot diameter tank, talking 300 feet.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a very unique deposit if we only have one or the other in 300 feet.
So eh, what else what else stuck out at you in this paper?
I, I find it interesting that all geotechs, including, kind of the father of geotechnics, we're always searching to find one parameter we can apply to 15 different problems.
Well, yeah,
So we're
exactly.
talking horizontal modulus of subgrade reaction, which I've seen in some geotech reports in lieu of, PY parameters that you can put into LPIL. Some people are giving horizontal modulus of subgrade reactions. All these things, there's a lot of good stuff in here. And I think the overarching theme that's the most important piece of this paper is the tone of how interactive these things are and the communication and how the design process works and how explicitly it's stated that the structural and the geotech are discussing these things and they're interacting and they're in a lot of cases they may have been the same person, right? At this point in time there's
You got it.
structurals who are learning about soil mechanics and are doing these things from start to finish themselves.
And that's a good point. In 1955, you probably had people that were formally educated in structural engineering that were now learning about the ground stiffness. My eyes immediately went to the conclusion when I the first thing I read often in any technical paper,
Yeah.
and I couldn't help. I mean, for those of you that have not ever read the paper, it's worth it just to get the conclusions because they are amazing. And the last one here, uh, it would not be written today. Let's just say that. Number 5 in the conclusion is the fundamental equations of the theories of subgrade reaction have been obtained by a radical simplification of the real relations between contact pressure and corresponding displacement. However, under normal conditions, the errors due to these simplifications are adequately taken care of by the customary factor of safety in design. Okay, that's if I were to reword that, I would say we really don't know uh, what the modulus of subgrade reaction is in most cases. However, it probably doesn't matter. And I think that's the only thing. Let's not do. That's what he said in 55. And I think the sad part is that we've come to modern day. No one even has read this.
Mhm.
It would be better us. It would be better for us to know, hey, we're giving them a value, and probably it's not going to matter.
Yeah.
Now there might cases where we darn sure want to make sure they matter. We talked about those large tanks, mats with large buildings, etc.
Well, and going back to at the very beginning, you said that this has sometimes been a thorn in your side, and it has been for me too as a designer. But I think that what's kind of scary about that is how often it's not. That really this comes up when a specific structural engineer is like, wait a second, that doesn't match, or what is this value? This value is super important. And then you think about the hundreds of projects you've done where it was never discussed. And that design took place in a silo in the structural engineering firm before you even got brought on to do the geotechnical design for the foundations. Or how many times do we change foundation types in the middle of a design process and the footings stay the same size?
Yeah.
It begs the question, is it really being used? How important is it?
That going back why it may not have bit us, and I can only speculate. And I imagine that, for example, we probably get if you're a structural engineer and you've put 12-inch slabs beneath every warehouse, and then suddenly we give them a Modulus subgrade reaction that says it needs to be 3 inches.
Yeah.
They're gonna write that on paper, they're gonna put 12 inches,
Yeah.
and they might just say,
Yeah.
even though my calculation, but I know a 12-inch will work. I don't know that a 3-inch will work.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think the other big piece that stands out of this is the significant discussion about plate load testing. And I think even I know in my career we've done a lot of load testing. I've seen very little plate load testing performed on sites. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I think that's more of a regional thing. I think in some regions it's happening on every project. I know you've probably seen more of it than I have. I'm not seeing those results a lot of times. And again, it comes back to if you are adjusting up from a plate load test, what's the depth of influence of your structure versus that plate load test, and how does that scaling work?
Nope. I totally agree. And in fact, there is a section on this paper where it even warns the person reading this paper, warns the reader that says a plate load test may not even capture all of it. Because we don't hold a plate load test enough for full consolidation to occur in clay. So it kind of, and interestingly enough, it warns people about that.
Yeah.
So it's
and so we're back to, is this based on something empirical? Is this based on something that you can measure? And I'm sure we'll get to that as we discuss some of this other stuff, but and kind of what the path forward would be if we wanted to make this value better, how do you do that?
I mean, and I think, I guess even if we're going to be stuck with one value, and we know that in many cases doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it would serve us, our community, is to at least kind of make a different presentation.
Yeah.
And I think it certainly changes mine.
Yeah.
If I'm writing a report and I say, nope, it's a 150 PCI, and somebody calls up and says, hey, what's the design value? And we can't provide you that, or ground improvement designer. It doesn't matter. All right. So let's switch gears. So, we went from Terzaghi's 1955 paper, and of course I think that was partially responsible for how NAFAC wrote their section on Modulus subgrade reaction. And then we came, then we got more complex, right? Now we began to take, going from probably silos and tanks to, real mat foundations.
Yep.
Where the whole mat is, structure ties into it, bigger buildings. And we got to do something with that Modulus subgrade reaction. That leads us to the document in your hand.
Yep.
All right. So, what year was that?
This is 95, I think.
95.
1995. So 40 years
1995.
after that.
So the design and performance of mat foundations state-of-the-art review was
ACI SP 152.
That was a revolutionary book for me. It changed the way I thought of the modulus values.
Yeah. And I think what strikes me the most about I think the preface and the introductions they just really illustrate the change in tone in 40 years between Terzaghi's assumption that someone's taking this from start to finish. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of discussion in here kind of bemoaning the fact that structures and geotech are separated and that aren't not following the design hand in hand throughout the process, that geotechnical reports are written, design happens,
and then it's
built.
That's right. And structural engineers act as, and again, I'm not hitting on anybody, but they look at that value and think it is written in stone that that soil, it's good for that, and then off the races.
And in some ways I don't blame them, right? That if you're presented with the idea, and so much of structures is about, you think about concrete and steel design, so much of it is based on modulus values and yields and all these things. And so I think I understand why they would think that
I
we're
totally agree.
considering all those things and that soils can be captured in one value. And, you take 0.6 times this divided by this, and you get a number. And
So read that. I want Taylor had found right in that was it the very first part? Wasn't it like the second page or something? Where
trying to remember where that was.
was like the very like in the forward where he
Oh, so yeah. So in the preface, it says, and this was in the bottom of the second paragraph, it says the subgrade reaction beneath a mat foundation will vary, and the use of a single subgrade reaction value for an entire mat foundation will lead to wrong designs.
there you go. That blew me away as a young man.
Yeah.
And what with that publication introduced, and this was to me at least, when it was published, 95, was this idea that they called Ed Ulrich calls it the discrete area method.
Mm-hmm.
But what he really is just at that point, he clearly uses the modulus of subgrade reaction as a communication device to the structural engineer.
Yeah.
That's all he's saying. So he's saying, I'm going to run my settlement analysis. I'm going to run settle 3 or some finite element calculations or something like that to get a profile of settlement beneath the stress.
Yep.
And then I'm going to take the stress that's applied at a location divided by the displacement, and that's going to be a K.
Yep.
And I could do that for every point, or I could do that for discrete areas.
Yep. Yeah. So the concept of having a discrete column coming into a mat foundation versus, we've seen a lot, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers and listeners have seen a lot in the last 5 years of these mega warehouses, as the Amazons of the world, and a lot of the battery manufacturers were getting into electric vehicle production, these things where we may have a slab that has a legitimate uniform aerial load of 1,200 to 1,500 PSF over an area of hundreds of feet long and maybe even hundreds of feet wide.
Yep.
And some of these problems that they were looking at in these collection of papers and Terzaghi's paper, I think have kind of come full circle, where I think that we're back to maybe it works on an 8x8 footing, and maybe it's different for what we're seeing now.
Well, no, I agree with you. Now think about this. So let's just take that wide area.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just take that Amazon, that big wide area. Someone might say, well, it's almost uniform pressure. I'm not saying it is, but it's almost uniform pressure. Can I use a uniform modulus value?
It depends. The answer, Eric Lohr always says the answer is it depends.
Well, right. Yeah. See, you've been listening to that. I know that's exactly what Eric would say. No, but I'm thinking here is that the answer's in most likely, even if the ground condition, no, because the deeper stresses go deeper near the center.
Right. So you think about how would that uniform load even be assembled, right? And I think this is an important concept. I just had a call about a project yesterday that was, the geotechnical engineer was saying, well, these footings are only 8 foot by 15 foot. They're slabs. They're holding up like solar panels or something. And I said, yeah, but there's 30 of them side by side.
That's right.
So you get overlapping stresses. And so in an area, the answer is no,
right?
Because the center of the mat would be influenced more
by the exterior. And frankly, the center is going to be in terms of just the modulus value, you're going to have a softer modulus at the center.
Yeah.
Because you need to represent that overlapping stress, and the center is going to the edges.
Yep.
It's going to be a stiffer response.
Right. And the thickness of the slab matters.
The thickness of the slab,
The
the more rigid, the
and
more.
I told you earlier, but in this book, there's a title of the paper talking about subgrade modulus and mat design being a soil structure interaction problem. And I think everyone who's listening to this has seen several complicated finite element models of blast explosions and
Sure,
all these
sure.
complicated soil
Earthquakes
structure.
beneath a.
But what the most common soil structure interaction problem might be foundations and subgrade modulus of reaction.
No doubt about it. The soil, the settlement profile of the soil affects the bending characteristics
Yep.
of the mat or the slab, and the mat or the slab stiffness will help direct what the stresses are,
Yep.
which will then in turn affect the settlement profile.
Which we've done several projects that we've done these together where what that results in is there needs to be an iteration, right? So as we analyze it for a certain provided loading map, then if the K's change, the loading changes because the load follows the stiffness.
So let's think about this. So let's, for our listeners, is we've kind of let's just say that we've done our share of criticism at this point.
For sure.
And that's my specialty. So but now let's kind of walk through as we have, let's just say that we've got, you know, project engineers coming to us and they're saying they've got different ranges of projects and how would they handle them. Let's just say an engineer comes to you and say, I've got a floor slab and it's going to have forklift traffic.
Yep.
What's my modulus of subgrade reaction? How do I assign it?
I mean, I think that you think about, you break it down into its components, right? The traffic's probably a transient load.
Okay.
You've got a fast rate of loading. I think that the width of the applied load's pretty low.
Yep.
I think that you're probably going to, in that result, you wouldn't expect a lot of deflection, so then you would expect a pretty high modulus of subgrade reaction.
And would you say that we have probably a pretty good database throughout time of small diameter plate load tests that are published?
Yes.
So that 150 PCI, probably, like Terzaghi said, we're certainly not going to write that in a report. It has error in it, but probably not enough error to matter.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're going to go more complex. So now we move to a tank with, let's say, uniform pressure.
Yep.
So now what are we going to tell them how to do? Apply a.
So I think now you have to start looking at the variation of the pressure, the variation of the settlement that you would predict being higher at the center under the same applied loading if it's a uniform pressure than the outside. And so you would assign zones of increasing modulus of subgrade reaction as you move towards the edges.
Okay.
And you would want to run the first settlement model and then provide those zones back to the structural engineer, and you would see if they need to adjust anything or if it's compatible with what they're seeing in their model.
Okay.
Because the deflections that they
you're already Taylor Day's ready to iterate right then.
I'm always wanting to interact with structural engineers. In that case, you probably won't get any. There probably won't be an iteration if the assumption is that the loading is uniform.
And won't change.
It won't change.
And won't change. But although I do agree with you, and I think the discrete area is going to give you a much better if you run a settlement analysis, a geotechnical settlement analysis, and then compute really concentric rings, right?
Yep.
Of modulus. That's the most rational. I think that's the defensible way to do it. Now let's go to the extreme. Let's go to mat foundation with, a pressure diagram that looks like, a heat map of.
So we've seen a lot of these, and I'm sure a lot of the people listening have seen let's say a tall building with a pedestal or something where you've
Okay.
got columns bringing down heavy loads
Let's say it's a
into.
seismic area.
Oh, okay, yeah.
All right.
Now we're really in it.
And
Yeah.
so now what is Taylor Day going to do? How is he going to handle this problem?
Well, first I'm going to ask the structural engineer if they're modeling the static and the seismic separately,
And he's going to have to.
and they're going to have to.
So are they going to give you two different heat maps?
They should. Yeah.
Okay.
And this is granted, we have to say this happens on very complex, uh, very in-depth projects. You're not going to see a lot of these normally. Um, I wouldn't expect people to see a lot of these. But once you have those, you would use that discrete area method, which is really, there is some engineering judgment involved in this, right? Like you're doing your settlement analysis and you're defining these zones of where do I think it's appropriate to cut off and change um, my modulus of subgrade reaction that I'm calculating and providing back to the structural. And you're going to have to give them those dimensions and everything relative to their plan. And then they will run it again and their heat map will change, which makes sense. It's one of the most fundamental engineering properties, right? That the load's going to follow the stiffness and the response is going to change based on we're changing the stiffness. So
It's that's exactly and we have, I think you and I have worked on projects together where we have even gone so far as we have used, let's just say, the same point locations as the structural engineer does in his model.
Yep.
So let's just say he defines K in his structural mat every foot, foot by foot in
Yep.
both directions. We'll define that in our geotechnical model.
Yes.
And then, so what we'll give them is they give us a pressure. We put that pressure in, we get a settlement, we compute a K value.
Yep.
We give them the K value, they put it in, they give us back a pressure.
Yep.
Then we put that pressure in, we recompute, and we check through each iteration how much change in K value results.
Yep.
And once we're satisfied that any future iteration will not really change the K value.
Yeah. And
we've reached in that.
what I would expect to see in that heat map is that the load's kind of spreading out, right? The stiffness of the mat and the stiffness of the subgrade relative to the pressures that are being applied, it's distributing that pressure and you're getting less settlements. And so your values are changing until, which is consistent with what we've seen in real life, right? We're not seeing this huge dishing of mats under big buildings.
Nope.
I mean, sometimes, but that's real bad.
And we do that really twice, right? So we're going to do a first one with a model that the soil is represented with consolidation.
Yep.
And then we're going to do a second one where we're going to make it more, let's just say, closer to undrained.
Yeah.
Because during the seismic event, we're going to have a more undrained response in clays and really a viscous response.
Yep.
Maybe even certainly in saturated sands.
For sure. Yeah. And so, I mean, we think about the ideas of seismic engineering and, generating pore pressures and, putting load on those pore spaces. It's an undrained thing. And so the fundamental model has to change based on the rate of loading.
Very good. Well, Taylor, Taylor, I think we've solved the world's problems.
Like always.
Hey, well, everybody's going out there. Now we know subgrade modulus. All right, so let's close. Let's think about a few things. What you're talking to a project engineer. He's out of school. How big of a deal is it that he grasped these concepts? How?
I think my view on that's probably a little bit different. I'm probably coming at it from a little bit different angle than you. I think it's really important. I think it's vitally important that you understand the concept, because the concepts are related to how things are loaded and how they deflect under those loads. And I think I mean, if we had to really boil down what we do, it's how do we manage deflections under applied loads? And so conceptually, it's huge.
Okay.
I think practically, It depends on the critical nature of the structure and does this need to be done for this kind of complex stuff need to be done for every Dollar General in the seismic area? Probably not. Um, but you just need to understand when it matters.
That's right.
Yeah.
Where are you at on that spectrum?
Does it matter?
Does it really matter? And then all of a sudden, bam, someday it matters. You just need to be, not only do you need to know what it means, but you also kind of need to know when you get there.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I take these papers summarize something that I really believe is that we always have a design basis on the geotech side, and the structural has a design basis on their side. I think as long as we understand each other's design basis, then it's okay to say it may not matter. But say, some of the folks listening to this may be working in California or Seattle where they're doing performance-based designs where deflection really matters and load paths really matter.
Yeah.
And so in those cases, it's critical.
Yeah.
So I think for the general everyday geotechnical report, sometimes I think it would be better to not even have it in there and to provide it upon request when you can get some more information.
Yeah.
I think that's my approach.
Wouldn't it make sense, right? That it says that, once the loading has been better developed, then we can analyze what the deflection will be and provide feedback in terms of
geotechnical engineers have an opportunity to force that interaction between the structurals and the geotechs to get better value for your clients and to get better risk protection in critical structures.
Well, very good. Taylor, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you all learned something a little bit. I certainly did. Every time I talk to Taylor, I learn something. Thanks, everybody. Take care.